The fluorescent lights of Federal Courtroom 8A cast harsh shadows across the faces of everyone present, but none more so than on Elena Harper. She sat in the witness chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a simple black dress and cardigan that screamed service industry worker trying to look respectable for court. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the same practical bun she wore every day at Marino's restaurant, and her only jewellery was a small gold cross that caught the light when she shifted nervously. To everyone in the packed courtroom, she looked exactly like what the court documents claimed, a waitress who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Nothing about her suggested she was anything more than an unfortunate witness to conversations she probably didn't fully understand. Federal Prosecutor David Morrison shuffled through his notes, occasionally glancing up at Elena with the practiced indifference of someone who had questioned hundreds of witnesses. This was supposed to be routine. A waitress who overheard some conversations, standard procedure in organised crime cases. Defence attorney Catherine Blake, representing alleged crime boss Victor Petrov, looked confident, almost bored. Her client sat at the defence table in a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair immaculately styled, every inch the successful businessman he claimed to be. His dark eyes held no concern as they settled on the nervous waitress. What could she possibly know that would threaten a man who had survived 30 years in the shadows? Judge Margaret Thornton called the court to order with her characteristic efficiency. She had presided over dozens of racketeering cases, and nothing in the preliminary depositions suggested this would be anything other than another witness who might have overheard fragments of conversation in a crowded restaurant. "The prosecution calls Elena Harper to the witness stand," Morrison announced. "From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing to see more tales of those who hide their true strength until the moment it's needed most." Elena walked to the witness stand with careful steps, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She raised her right hand and took the oath in a voice barely above a whisper, her slight nervousness adding an extra layer of vulnerability to her appearance. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." Morrison began. "Elena Harper. I am a waitress at Marino's restaurant on 5th Street, she replied, her eyes fixed on her hands rather than meeting anyone's gaze. "How long have you worked at Marino's, Miss Harper?" 3 years, sir. Morrison nodded, making notes. "During your employment, have you had occasion to serve customers at a table regularly occupied by the defendant, Mr. Petrov, and his associates?" "Yes, sir. They come maybe 2-3 times each month, always Thursday evening, always same table in corner." Defence attorney Blake jotted something on her legal pad. The pattern of questioning was standard, almost mundane. Nothing here suggested any surprises. But what nobody in that courtroom knew yet was that Elena Harper had been counting those Thursday evenings for a very specific reason. And in exactly 47 minutes, when she finally spoke the truth, that count would destroy everything Victor Petrov had built over 3 decades. "Did you ever overhear conversations at this table?" Elena shifted uncomfortably. "Sometimes, when serving drinks, taking plates, but mostly they speak quiet." "But you did hear some things?" "A little bit, yes." But Elena's definition of a little bit would soon prove to the understatement of the century. Because while she sat there nervously fidgeting with her hands, her mind held the complete architectural blueprint of a criminal empire that had taken law enforcement 15 years to even identify. The small apartment in Queens was sparse, functional. Elena Harper stood before a mirror, practicing the nervous gestures she would need to master. Behind her, FBI Special Agent in Charge Robert Kane reviewed her cover identity one final time. "Remember," Kane said, "you're not just playing a waitress. You're playing someone who appears incapable of understanding the significance of what she's witnessing." Elena nodded, deliberately slumping her shoulders, letting her voice become smaller. "Like this? Perfect. The moment they suspect you understand even a fraction of what you're hearing, you're dead." Morrison approached the witness stand, unaware that his seemingly simple witness carried enough evidence to topple governments. "Miss Harper, I want you to think carefully. On the evening of March 15th of this year, do you remember serving Mr. Petrov and his associates? Elena nodded slowly. Yes, I remember because it was a busy night. Many customers. Do you recall overhearing any part of their conversation that evening? She hesitated, glancing briefly toward Petrov before returning her gaze to her hands. They talked about numbers. Money, I think. Can you be more specific? They mentioned shipping. Something about containers from... She paused as if struggling to remember. From overseas. What Elena didn't mention was that she knew the exact shipping manifests, the names of every ship, and the location of 17 different warehouses across the eastern seaboard. But that revelation was still 38 minutes away, and when it came, it would leave Viktor Petrov wondering how a simple waitress could possibly know details that even his own lieutenants weren't privy to. Blake stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating about the meaning of conversations she admittedly only partially heard. Sustained, Judge Thornton ruled. The jury will disregard the witness's interpretation of what she heard. Morrison continued his questioning, drawing out small details about dates, times, and fragments of overheard conversations. To everyone present, it appeared to be a standard attempt to build a circumstantial case with whatever scraps of information a waitress might have picked up. Miss Harper, you mentioned that Mr. Petrov and his associates sometimes spoke in languages other than English. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Do you understand these other languages? Elena shook her head quickly. No, sir. I only speak English and a little bit of Spanish from high school. Morrison made another note. The admission seemed to limit the value of her testimony. If she couldn't understand the foreign language conversations, her usefulness as a witness was minimal. But Morrison had no idea that hidden in his witness's purse was a recording device that had captured over 400 hours of multilingual criminal conversations. And in 22 minutes, when Elena finally revealed the truth about her language abilities, the prosecutor would realize he'd been sitting on the intelligence coup of the decade. It was a busy Thursday night at Marino's. Elena moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling water glasses and taking orders. At table 12, Viktor Petrov was deep in conversation with 3 men she'd learned to identify as his top lieutenants. Dmitri's shipment arrives Tuesday, Petrov said in Russian, not bothering to lower his voice. After all, what could a waitress possibly understand? Elena's hand didn't shake as she poured his coffee, but her mind was recording every detail. Dmitri Volganin, she knew from her briefings, was Petrov's contact in St. Petersburg. Tuesday meant March 15th. The shipment was the $40 million heroin operation that the FBI had been trying to track for 2 years. The Italian problem? Asked Marcus Torino in accented English. Risolto, Petrov replied smoothly in Italian. Resolved. Elena's doctoral dissertation at Johns Hopkins had focused on Romance language etymology. She understood not just his words, but the specific dialect that indicated Petrov had spent significant time in Sicily, intelligence that would prove crucial in understanding his connections to the Cosa Nostra. When they spoke in Russian or Italian, could you understand what they were discussing? Only how you say pieces, words here and there that sounded familiar. If the courtroom had known that Elena's pieces included complete organizational charts of 3 separate crime families, detailed knowledge of their financial operations, and evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of state government, the trial would have been declared a national security matter and moved to a classified facility. Can you share with the court any specific foreign words or phrases you remember hearing? Blake was on her feet again. Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already testified that she doesn't speak these languages. Any interpretation would be unreliable. Before Judge Thornton could rule, Elena spoke up quietly. I remember some words that sounded like English. The judge nodded. I'll allow it, but the jury should consider the witness's admitted limited understanding. Continue. Elena took a breath. They used a word that sounded like transport, and something about problema. Problems? I think so, yes. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, with Morrison drawing out a handful of foreign words and phrases that painted a vague picture of illegal activity. Nothing specific, nothing damning, Just enough to add another small piece to the prosecution's circumstantial case. But hidden beneath Elena's nervous exterior was a memory palace containing enough evidence to justify simultaneous raids across 5 states. In exactly 14 minutes, the palace would be unlocked, and Viktor Petrov would finally understand why the FBI had been so confident about pursuing this case. The restaurant was unusually quiet for a Thursday evening. Elena had just served Petrov his usual coffee when his phone rang. She was clearing the neighbouring table, close enough to overhear but invisible enough to be ignored. "Judge Morrison has been asking questions about the Baltimore operation," Petrov said in Russian to whoever was on the other end. Elena's blood went cold. Judge Morrison was her father's brother, her uncle. And she now realised that the corruption in the federal judiciary went deeper than anyone at the FBI suspected. That night, she made a decision that would haunt her for months. Instead of reporting the information immediately, she chose to continue gathering evidence. She needed to know how extensive the corruption was before she could trust anyone, even within the Bureau. It was a decision that would ultimately save her life, because 3 weeks later she would discover that her own FBI handler had been compromised. When Morrison concluded his direct examination, the courtroom felt the familiar rhythm of a routine witness testimony winding down. Catherine Blake rose for cross-examination with the confidence of someone who saw no real threat in what they'd just heard. "Miss Harper," Blake began, her tone professional but dismissive. "You testified that you've worked as a waitress at Marino's for 3 years, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And before Marino's, where did you work?" Elena hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Different restaurant, also waitress." "Which restaurant?" "Small place, nothing important." Blake made a note. "Miss Harper, isn't it true that you've worked as a waitress for most of your adult life?" "Yes." "And your educational background?" "High school, some community college." Blake paced in front of the witness stand. "Miss Harper, you testified that you understand only basic Spanish and no Russian or Italian. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "But you claim to remember specific words from conversations in these languages?" Elena shifted in her seat. "Only words that sounded like English words." "How convenient," Blake said with obvious skepticism. "Miss Harper, isn't it true that you're simply guessing at the meaning of sounds you heard?" I just remembered what they sounded like." The defense attorney's tone sharpened slightly. "Miss Harper, isn't it convenient that the words you remember just happen to support the prosecution's case?" Morrison stood. "Objection. Argumentative. Sustained." Blake changed tactics. "Miss Harper, during these alleged conversations you overheard, did Mr. Petrov or his associates ever acknowledge your presence?" "No, ma'am." "They never seemed concerned that you might be listening?" "No. In fact, they appeared to consider you completely insignificant, didn't they?" Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They didn't pay attention to the waitress." "Exactly, because you're just a waitress, someone invisible, forgettable. Isn't that right?" The slight pause before Elena answered was so brief that most people in the courtroom missed it entirely, but something flickered behind her eyes for just an instant. Yes, just a waitress. What Blake didn't know was that this just a waitress had memorized the complete financial structure of Petrov's money laundering operations, including bank account numbers in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Dubai. But that bombshell was still 8 minutes away, and when it detonated, it would reveal corruption in places no one had thought to look. Blake continued her attack on Elena's credibility for another 15 minutes, painting her as an unreliable witness whose limited education and working-class background made her testimony suspect. It was a standard defense strategy, and it appeared to be working. Several jurors looked skeptical of the nervous young woman in the witness chair. As Blake concluded her cross-examination and returned to her seat, Judge Thornton asked if the prosecution had any redirect examination. "Just a few questions, Your Honor," Morrison replied. Morrison approached the witness stand, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Harper, defense counsel suggested that Mr. Petrov and his associates considered you invisible. In your experience working at Marino's, is that how customers generally treat waitstaff?" "Many customers, yes. They don't see us as people, just service." "And in your observation, did Mr. Petrov and his associates fall into that category?" "Yes, They acted like I wasn't there. Morrison nodded. Miss Harper, I want to ask you about the evening of March 15th again. You testified that you heard fragments of conversation in foreign languages, but I want to be very specific about this. He pulled out a legal pad filled with notes. You mentioned hearing words about transport. Are you certain that's what you heard? Elena nodded. Yes. And you're certain of your interpretation? Yes. Morrison consulted his notes again. Miss Harper, when Mr. Petrov used the word about transport on March 15th, what exactly was he referring to? Blake stood quickly. Objection, Your Honour. The witness has already testified that she only understood fragments. Your Honour, Morrison replied, I'm simply asking the witness to be specific about what she heard. I'll allow it, but be specific, counsel. Morrison turned back to Elena. What was Mr. Petrov specifically discussing when he mentioned transport? Elena looked directly at Morrison for the first time. He was talking about moving shipping container number B47821 from Port Newark to a warehouse facility in Elizabeth, New Jersey. The courtroom went dead silent. Blake shot to her feet. Objection! The witness testified she only understood fragments. But Morrison was already moving forward. Miss Harper, how can you be so specific about container numbers and locations if you only understood random words? Elena's posture had changed subtly. The nervous fidgeting had stopped. Her back was straighter. Her voice, when she answered, carried a different quality. Because he also mentioned that container B47821 was one of 12 containers shipped from Vladivostok on March 3rd aboard the cargo vessel Svetlana Mikhailova, and that it contained 37 kilograms of uncut heroin with a street value of approximately $4.2 million. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. But even this revelation was just the tip of the iceberg. Elena's mind held details about 57 other shipments, the names and locations of Petrov's suppliers, and evidence of similar operations in 12 major American cities. The full scope of what she knew would require 6 more hours of testimony and would ultimately lead to the largest organized crime bust in federal history. Elena's first day at Marino's had been carefully orchestrated. She'd spent months establishing her cover identity, complete with employment history, social media presence, and even a boyfriend who occasionally picked her up after work, actually Agent Kevin Rourke from the Cyber Crimes Unit. Table 12, the manager had said, pointing to the corner booth. That's Mr. Petrov's regular table. He tips well, but he's particular about his coffee. 1 sugar, no cream, and he likes the cup warmed first. Elena had nodded, playing the eager-to-please new employee. She had no way of knowing that within a year she would be sitting across from Petrov's granddaughter at a school play, listening to him brag about the child's academic achievements while simultaneously planning the murder of a federal witness. That granddaughter, Sophia, was 8 years old and wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. She would be 12 when her grandfather was sentenced to life in prison, and Elena would sometimes wonder if Sophia would understand someday that the nice waitress who always asked about her school plays was the one who brought justice to her family's crimes. Judge Thornton leaned forward. Miss Harper, how could you possibly know such specific details if you only understand fragments of conversation? Elena met the judge's eyes directly for the first time. Gone was the nervous, uncertain waitress. The woman looking back at Judge Thornton had steady, intelligent eyes that seemed to calculate and assess everything in the room. Because, Your Honour, I understood every word. Blake was on her feet, her voice sharp with alarm. Your Honour, the witness has clearly lied under oath. She testified under direct examination that she only understood basic Spanish. Morrison stepped forward. Miss Harper, did you lie when you testified about your language abilities? No, sir. How can that be true? Elena's slight smile was the first genuine expression she'd shown since taking the stand. Because I also speak Russian, Italian, Arabic, Mandarin, German, and French. Spanish is indeed only basic compared to my other languages. The courtroom erupted. Defense attorney Blake was shouting objections while prosecutor Morrison tried to restore order. Judge Thornton banged her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. The composed, confident woman now sitting in the witness chair bore no resemblance to the nervous waitress who had testified just minutes earlier. And yet, even this stunning revelation barely scratched the surface of Elena Harper's true capabilities. What the courtroom didn't know was that she also spoke Arabic fluently enough to have worked undercover in 3 Middle Eastern countries, and that her Mandarin was sophisticated enough that she'd once posed as a translator for Chinese intelligence operations. Languages were just the beginning of her skills. "Your Honor," Blake demanded, "I move for a mistrial. This witness has clearly committed perjury." "Your Honor," Morrison countered, "the witness answered truthfully. She was never asked about specific languages beyond Spanish." Judge Thornton called for order, but her own expression showed she was as stunned as everyone else in the courtroom. "Miss Harper, I'm going to ask you directly. What is your background?" Elena looked around the courtroom, her gaze lingering on Viktor Petrov, whose face had gone ashen. "Your Honor, for the past 3 years, I have worked as a waitress at Marino's restaurant. That part of my testimony was completely truthful." "And before that?" "Before that, I was a senior intelligence analyst with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, specializing in Eastern European and Italian-American criminal organizations." The courtroom exploded again. Reporters in the gallery were frantically typing on phones and laptops. Several of Petrov's supporters headed for the exits. Judge Thornton pounded her gavel so hard it echoed like gunshots. But what Elena hadn't mentioned yet was that before joining the FBI, she had spent 2 years with the CIA's Special Operations Group, and before that, she'd been recruited directly from graduate school by a joint task force that officially didn't exist. Her true background made her FBI credentials look like an entry-level position. The recruitment had happened in her final semester at Johns Hopkins. Elena was defending her doctoral dissertation on linguistic patterns in transnational criminal organizations when a woman in the back row asked a question that made it clear she'd read classified intelligence reports. After the defense, the woman approached. "Agent Sarah Martinez, CIA Special Activities Division. We'd like to talk." That conversation led to 6 months of training at Camp Perry, where Elena learned that language skills were just the foundation for deep cover work. She learned to alter her gait, her breathing patterns, even her eating habits to match whatever identity she was assuming. "The best operatives," her instructor had said, "don't just play a role. They become the role so completely that they forget who they used to be." It was advice that would serve her well years later when she had to maintain her cover as Elena Harper while watching Viktor Petrov order executions over dinner. "Order. I will clear this courtroom if necessary." When quiet finally returned, Judge Thornton addressed Elena directly. "Miss Harper, is that your real name?" "Elena is real. My full name is Elena Harper Morrison, and I am currently on extended deep cover assignment with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Blake's voice cracked with desperation. "Your Honor, this is entrapment. This is prosecutorial misconduct." But Morrison was already presenting documents to the judge. "Your Honor, Agent Morrison has been operating under proper federal authority. All protocols were followed." Judge Thornton examined the documents with growing amazement. "These authorizations are extraordinary." Morrison turned back to his witness, and the family resemblance was suddenly obvious to everyone in the courtroom. "Agent Morrison, can you tell the court about your assignment at Marino's restaurant?" 3 years ago, intelligence indicated that Viktor Petrov was using Marino's as a regular meeting place for high-level criminal planning. I was assigned to establish deep cover as a waitress to monitor and record these meetings. "And were you successful in this monitoring?" Elena reached into her purse and removed what appeared to be an ordinary server's pen. "This pen contains a recording device. Over 3 years, I have documented 147 separate criminal conspiracies planned at Table 12 of Marino's restaurant." Petrov, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke with a thick Russian accent. "This is impossible. We checked for surveillance. We used countermeasures." Blake immediately tried to silence her client, but the damage was done. His admission that they had used countermeasures was effectively a confession that they had been engaged in activities requiring countermeasures. Agent Morrison continued her testimony. "Mr. Petrov's organization did indeed employ sophisticated anti-surveillance techniques. They used white noise generators, signal jammers, and even had the restaurant swept for listening devices monthly. But they never suspected the waitress? No, sir. In their experience, service staff are invisible. Viktor Petrov has spent 30 years assuming that anyone in a service position is beneath his notice and incapable of sophisticated thinking. She looked directly at Petrov as she spoke, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see her. The recognition in his eyes was painful to watch. The irony, Agent Morrison continued, is that for 3 years, Mr. Petrov regularly discussed the most sensitive criminal operations directly in front of a federal agent, because he couldn't conceive that a waitress might be intelligent enough to understand what she was hearing. Morrison presented evidence to the court. Agent Morrison, do you have recordings of Mr. Petrov discussing specific criminal activities? Yes, sir. Would you like me to play them for the court? Before Blake could object, Petrov stood up at the defense table. His composure had cracked completely. You were there for 3 years, he said, his Russian accent thicker than usual. 3 years, you brought me coffee. You remembered I like sugar, no cream. You asked about my grandchildren. Agent Morrison's professional facade softened slightly. Your granddaughter is beautiful, Mr. Petrov. The picture you showed me of her at the dance recital was lovely. The human moment passed quickly and her official demeanor returned. But you also ordered the deaths of 7 people during conversations I witnessed. You planned the importation of over 200 kilograms of heroin. You discussed bribing federal judges and intimidating witnesses. She reached into her purse again and placed a small digital recorder on the witness stand. Would you like me to play the conversation from February 8th, where you specifically ordered the murder of Customs Inspector James Rodriguez? Petrov sat down heavily, his face in his hands. Blake was frantically whispering to him, but he wasn't listening anymore. Judge Thornton called for a brief recess to allow both sides to consult with their clients and superiors. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, the gallery had filled with additional FBI agents and federal prosecutors. This was no longer just a trial, it was the conclusion of a major federal investigation. Agent Morrison, Prosecutor Morrison continued, can you tell the court about your qualifications for this assignment? I have a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University and a doctorate in applied linguistics from Johns Hopkins. I am fluent in 8 languages and have spent 12 years working undercover in various criminal organizations. What made you particularly suited for infiltrating Mr. Petrov's organization? My background includes extensive training in behavioral psychology and cultural linguistics. I understand not just the languages that these criminal organizations use, but the cultural contexts that shape how they communicate. She gestured toward the defense table. For example, when Mr. Petrov and his associates discussed fishing trips to Brighton Beach, they weren't talking about recreation. In the cultural and linguistic context of Russian organized crime, fishing refers to debt collection activities that typically involve violence. Blake stood up. Your Honor, I object to this witness providing expert testimony on cultural interpretation. Your Honor, Morrison replied, Agent Morrison is testifying about her direct observations and her professional qualifications to interpret what she observed. I'll allow it. Continue. Agent Morrison looked directly at the jury. Over 3 years, I witnessed Mr. Petrov and his organization plan and coordinate the importation of over 500 kilograms of heroin, the murders of 8 individuals, the corruption of 12 federal and local officials, and the laundering of approximately $40 million. She pulled out a thick file folder. I have detailed recordings, photographs, and documentation of all of these activities. The prosecutor approached his daughter agent. Agent Morrison, why did this operation take 3 years? Mr. Petrov's organization operates in cells. Each cell only knows pieces of the overall operation. To build a comprehensive case that would dismantle the entire network, we needed to identify all the key players, understand the complete structure, and document the full scope of their criminal activities. And have you achieved that goal? Elena smiled for the first time since revealing her identity. Yes, sir. Based on the intelligence gathered during this operation, the FBI executed simultaneous raids this morning on 47 locations across 5 states. We arrested 83 members of the Petrov organization, including all of the senior leadership. The courtroom erupted again. Petrov's remaining supporters looked around frantically, several reaching for their phones only to discover that cell service in the courthouse had been jammed. Blake was shouting objections, but Judge Thornton had regained control. Order! Agent Morrison, are you telling this court that a major federal operation concluded this morning based on evidence you gathered while working as a waitress? Yes, Your Honor. Operation Deep Cover concluded at 6 a.m. today with the arrest of the entire Petrov criminal network. Judge Thornton shook her head in amazement. In 30 years on the bench, I have never seen anything like this. Agent Morrison reached into her purse one final time and removed a small device that looked like a hearing aid. Your Honor, for the past 3 years, every conversation I've had in this courtroom has been transmitted in real time to FBI headquarters. Blake went pale. What are you saying? I'm saying that Mr. Petrov's instructions to you regarding witness intimidation, jury tampering, and obstruction of justice have all been recorded and transmitted to federal authorities. Blake started backing toward the exit, but FBI agents had already positioned themselves at all the courtroom doors. Agent Morrison continued, Ms. Blake, at 10:47 this morning, you advised your client to eliminate the Harper problem permanently. At 11:23, you contacted known associate Marcus Delacroix to arrange for my assassination. At 11:45, you transferred $50,000 to an account controlled by the Torino crime family as payment for a contract killing. Blake was now visibly shaking. This is entrapment. You can't use attorney-client privileged communications. Actually, Agent Morrison replied calmly, communications planning the commission of future crimes are not protected by attorney-client privilege. Your instructions to have me killed were criminal conspiracy, not legal advice. Judge Thornton had heard enough. Bailiff, place Miss Blake under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. As Blake was led away in handcuffs, screaming about constitutional violations, Agent Morrison turned to address Viktor Petrov directly. Mr. Petrov, 3 years ago when I started serving you coffee, you told me I reminded you of your granddaughter. You said I was simple but sweet. You tipped me well because you felt sorry for me. Petrov looked up at her with something approaching respect mixed with defeat. The irony, Agent Morrison continued, is that you were right. I am like your granddaughter. She's majoring in international relations at Columbia University. She speaks 4 languages. She wants to work for the State Department someday. She paused, letting that information sink in. The difference is that while your granddaughter will use her intelligence and education to serve her country legally, you used your intelligence to destroy lives and communities. You assumed that anyone in a service position must be unintelligent, incapable of understanding your sophistication. Petrov nodded slowly. I underestimated you. You underestimated all of us, Agent Morrison replied. Every waitress, every cleaning lady, every security guard you ignored while planning your crimes. You never considered that we might be watching, listening, remembering everything. The trial concluded with Viktor Petrov pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for cooperation in prosecuting other criminal organizations. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Catherine Blake was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. She received 25 years in federal prison and was disbarred. The recordings and evidence gathered by Agent Morrison led to the conviction of 83 members of the Petrov organization and the seizure of over $60 million in assets. 6 months later, Elena Harper Morrison received the FBI's highest honor for undercover work. In her acceptance speech, she said, "For 3 years, I served coffee to some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. They looked right through me because they couldn't imagine that someone pouring their drinks might be smarter than they were. Their arrogance was their downfall." The video of her courtroom revelation became the most watched court proceeding in federal history, with over 50 million views. Legal experts called it the most dramatic witness testimony ever recorded. Comments on the viral video ranged from amazement to admiration. This woman is a hero. 3 years of playing dumb while gathering evidence to bring down an entire crime family. The moment she revealed she spoke 8 languages gave me chills. What an incredible performance. Never underestimate the quiet ones. You never know who might be watching and listening. Elena Harper Morrison returned to FBI headquarters, where she now trains other agents in deep cover operations. Her methods, dubbed the Harper Protocol, are taught at the FBI Academy as the gold standard for long-term undercover work. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of Table 12 at Marino's restaurant, where for 3 years she served coffee to killers while secretly recording every word, waiting for the moment when justice would finally be served. The lesson of Elena Harper Morrison's story spread far beyond law enforcement. Service industry workers across the country reported feeling more respected, more noticed, after the video went viral. Employers began treating their staff with more dignity, and customers became more aware of the human beings serving them. Because Elena had proven something profound, intelligence, competence, and strength don't announce themselves with expensive suits or impressive titles. Sometimes they wear simple black dresses and serve coffee with a smile, waiting patiently for the moment when quiet observation becomes powerful testimony. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else?